John Adams was an American lawyer, author, statesman, and diplomat. He served as the second President of the United States, the first Vice President, and as a founding father was a leader of American independence from Great Britain. Adams was a political theorist in the Age of Enlightenment who promoted republicanism and a strong central government. His innovative ideas were frequently published. He was also a dedicated diarist and correspondent, particularly with his wife and key advisor Abigail. He collaborated with his cousin, Revolutionary leader Samuel Adams, but he established his own prominence prior to the American Revolution. After the Boston Massacre, despite severe local anti-British sentiment, he provided a successful though unpopular legal defense of the accused British soldiers. Driven by his devotion to the right to counsel and the protect of innocence. As a delegate from Massachusetts to the Continental Congress, Adams played a leading role in persuading Congress to declare independence. He assisted Thomas Jefferson in drafting the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and was its foremost advocate in the Congress. As a diplomat in Europe, he helped negotiate the eventual peace treaty with Great Britain, and acquired vital governmental loans from Amsterdam bankers. Adams was the primary author of the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, which influenced American political theory, as did his earlier thoughts on government. Adams' credentials as a revolutionary secured for him 2 terms as President, George Washington's vice president, and also his own election in 1796 as the second president. In his single term as president, he encountered fierce criticism from the Jeffersonian Republicans, as well as the dominant faction in his own Federalist Party, led by his opponent Alexander Hamilton. Adams signed the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, and built up the Army and Navy in the face of an undeclared naval quasi-war with France. The major accomplishment of his presidency was a peaceful resolution of the conflict in the face of Hamilton's opposition. Due to his strong posture on defense, Adams is often called the father of the American Navy. He was the first U.S. president to reside in the Executive Mansion, now known as the White House. In 1800, Adams lost re-election to Thomas Jefferson, and retired to Massachusetts. He resumed his friendship with Jefferson upon the latter's own retirement by initiating a correspondence which lasted 14 years. He and his wife established a family of politicians, diplomats, and historians now referred to as the Adams political family. Adams was the father of John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States. He died on the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Modern historians in the aggregate have ranked his administration favorably. Early life and education. Childhood. John Adams, Jr. was born on October 30, 1735, to John Adams and Susanna Boylston. He had 2 younger brothers, Peter and Elihu. Adams' birthplace was Quincy, Massachusetts, and is now part of Adams National Historical Park. Adams' mother was from a leading medical family of current Brookline, Massachusetts. His father was a Congregationalist deacon, a farmer, a cordwainer, and a lieutenant in the militia. He further served as a selectman and supervised the building of schools and roads. Adams often praised his father and recalled their close relationship. His paternal great-grandfather, David Adams, was born and bred at Fenpennebank, Llanboidy, Carmarthenshire, North Wales. He emigrated from Wales in 1675, and 60 years later his great-grandson, John Adams, was born. Though raised in modest surroundings, Adams felt an acute responsibility to live up to his family's heritage of reverence. He was a direct descendant of Puritans, who came to the American wilderness in the 1630s, established a colonial presence in America, and profoundly affected the culture, laws, and traditions of their region. Journalist Richard Brookhiser wrote that Adams' Puritan ancestors believed they lived in the Bible. England under the Stuarts was Egypt, they were Israel fleeing. to establish a refuge for godliness, a city upon a hill. By the time of John Adams' birth in 1735, Puritan tenets such as predestination were no longer as widely accepted, and many of their stricter practices had moderated with time. But Adams considered them bearers of freedom, a cause that still had a holy urgency. It was a value system he believed in and wished to live up to. Adams emphatically recalled that his parents held every species of libertinage in contempt and horror, and portrayed pictures of disgrace or baseness and of ruin from any debauchery. Adams, as the eldest child, was under a mandate from his parents to obtain a formal education. This began at age 6 at a dame school for boys and girls, which was conducted at a teacher's home, and centered upon the New England primer. Shortly thereafter, Adams attended Braintree Latin School under Joseph Cleverley, where studies included Latin, rhetoric, logic and arithmetic. Adams' reflections on early education were in the negative mostly, including incidents of truancy, a dislike for his master and a desire to become a farmer. All questions on the matter ended when his father commanded that he remain in school, saying, "You shall comply with my desires." Deacon Adams also retained a new schoolmaster, Joseph Marsh, and his son responded positively. College education and adulthood. At age 16, Adams entered Harvard College in 1751. He did not share his father's expectation that he become a minister. After graduating in 1755 with an A.B. degree, he taught school for a few years in Worcester, Massachusetts, while pondering his permanent vocation. In the next 4 years he discerned a passion for prestige, saying that he craved honor or reputation, and more deference from his fellows, and at age 21 he was determined to become a great man. He decided to become a lawyer to further those ends, writing his father that he found among lawyers noble and gallant achievements, but among the clergy, the pretended sanctity of some absolute dunces. Doctrinally, he later became a Unitarian, and dropped belief in predestination, eternal damnation, the divinity of Christ and most other Calvinist beliefs of his Puritan ancestors. Nevertheless, his remnant Puritanism frequently prompted reservations about his hunger for fame, which he once referred to as mere trumpery, and he questioned his not properly attending to the happiness of his fellow men. The French and Indian War began in 1754, and Adams began to struggle with the issue of a young man's responsibility in the conflict. Contemporaries of his social position were largely spectators, while those who were less solvent joined the battle as a means to make some money. Adams later said, "I longed more ardently to be a soldier than I ever did to be a lawyer." He was acutely aware that he was the first in his family that degenerated from the virtues of the house so far as not to have been an officer in the militia, law practice and marriage. Adams followed the usual course of reading the law in order to obtain his license to practice. In 1756 he became an apprentice in the office of John Putnam, a leading lawyer in Worcester. In 1758, he earned an A.M. from Harvard, and was also that year admitted to the bar, having completed his studies under Putnam. From an early age, he developed the habit of writing descriptions of events and impressions of men which are scattered through his diary, which included his report of the 1761 argument of James Otis, Jr., in the Massachusetts Superior Court as to the legality of writs of assistance. Otis's argument inspired Adams to the cause of the American colonies. In 1763 he had published 7 essays in Boston newspapers, treatises that represented his forging into the convoluted realm of political theory. The essays were offered anonymously, with Adams using the nom de plume, Humphrey Plowjogger. This author reappeared in the Boston Gazette in 1765 to oppose the Stamp Act. While Adams was initially not as popular as his cousin Samuel, his influence emerged through his work as a constitutional lawyer and his in-depth analysis of historical examples. together with his dedication to the principles of republicanism. Even so, Adams often found his inborn contentiousness to be a constraint in his political career. Adams married his third cousin Abigail Smith on October 25, 1764. Her parents were Elizabeth Quincy and Rev. William Smith, a Congregational minister at Weymouth, Massachusetts. They had 6 children: Abigail, Nabby, in 1765, future President John Quincy Adams in 1767, Susanna in 1768, Charles in 1770, Thomas in 1772, and Elizabeth in 1777. Career before the Revolution. Opponent of Stamp Act 1765, Adams first rose to prominence leading widespread opposition to the Stamp Act of 1765, imposed by the British Parliament without consulting the American legislatures, and requiring payment of a direct tax by the colonies for various stamped documents. Adams in 1765 authored the Braintree Instructions, a letter sent to the representatives of Braintree in the Massachusetts legislature, which served as a model for other towns' instructions. In the piece he explained that the Stamp Act should be opposed since it denied 2 fundamental rights guaranteed to all Englishmen, and which all freemen deserved: rights to be taxed only by consent and to be tried only by a jury of one's peers. The instructions were a succinct and forthright defense of colonial rights and liberties. In August 1765, reprising his pen name, Humphrey Plowjogger, he contributed 4 articles to the Boston Gazette. He delivered a speech in December before the Governor and Council in which he pronounced the Stamp Act invalid on the ground that Massachusetts, being without representation in Parliament, had not given its assent to it. He later observed that many protests were sparked by an oft-reprinted sermon of the Boston minister, Jonathan Mayhew, invoking Romans chapter 13 to justify insurrection. In 1766, a town meeting of Braintree elected John Adams as a selectman. He moved the family to Boston in April of 1768, renting a clapboard house on Brattle Street, a place known locally as the White House. He and Abigail and the children lived there for a year, then moved to Cold Lane. Still later they moved again, to a larger house in Brattle Square in the center of the city. Counsel for the British Boston Massacre in 1770, a street confrontation, known as the Boston Massacre, resulted in British soldiers killing 5 civilians. The accused soldiers were arrested on criminal charges and expectedly had trouble finding legal representation. Adams ultimately agreed to defend him, though he feared it would hurt his reputation. In arguing their case, Adams made his legendary statement regarding jury decisions: "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." He also expounded upon Blackstone's ratio. "It is more important that innocence be protected than it is that guilt be punished. For guilt and crimes are so frequent in this world that they cannot all be punished. But if innocence itself is brought to the bar and condemned, perhaps to die, then the citizen will say, 'Whether I do good or whether I do evil is immaterial, for innocence itself is no protection,' and if such an idea as that were to take hold in the mind of the citizen, that would be the end of security whatsoever." Adams won an acquittal for 6 of the soldiers. 2 of them, who had fired directly into the crowd, were charged with murder but were convicted only of manslaughter. Adams was paid a small sum by his clients. Biographer John Furling opines that Adams made the most of juror selection during the voir dire stage of the trial, saying that Adams expertly exercised his right to challenge individual jurors and contrived what amounted to a packed jury. Not only were several jurors closely tied through business arrangements of the British Army, but 5 ultimately became Loyalist exiles. Indeed, Hilaire B. Zabel, a scholar who has most closely studied the trial, concluded, "We can be fairly sure that, before a single witness had been sworn, The outcome of the trial was certain. Furling also surmises that Adams was likely encouraged to take the case in exchange for political office. When one of Boston's seats in the Massachusetts legislature opened 3 months later, Adams was the town's first choice to fill the vacancy. His law practice increased greatly from this exposure, as did the demands on his time. In 1771 he moved Abigail and the children to Braintree, but he kept his office in Boston, saying, "I shall spend more time in my office than ever I did." He also noted on the day of the family's move, "Now my family is away, I feel no inclination at all, no temptation, to be anywhere but at my office. I am in it by 6 in the morning, I am in it at 9 at night. In the evening, I can be alone at my office, and nowhere else. I never could in my family." Nevertheless, after some time in the capital, he became disenchanted with the rural and vulgar Braintree as a home for his family. In August 1772, therefore, Adams moved his family back to Boston. He purchased a large brick house on Queen Street, not far from his office. In 1774, due to the increasingly unstable situation in Boston, Adams and Abigail returned the family to the farm, and Braintree remained their permanent Massachusetts home. Objections to British Parliament's authority. Governor Thomas Hutchinson and his judges until 1772 received their salaries from the Massachusetts legislature. The Coercive Acts and the Tea Act were then passed by Parliament, and the British Crown assumed payment of those wages, drawn from customs revenues imposed upon that colony. According to biographer Furling, the British government thus singled out Massachusetts for reprisals of previous rebellion and hoped in the process to force the other colonies into line. Boston radicals protested and asked John Adams to proclaim their objections. In 2 replies of the Massachusetts House of Representatives to Governor Hutchinson, Adams argued that the colonists had never been under the sovereignty of Parliament. Their original charter, as well as their allegiance, was exclusively with the king. If a workable line could not be drawn between parliamentary sovereignty and the total independence of the colonies, he continued, the colonies would have no other choice but independence from England. Adams authored Novanglus, or A History of the Dispute with America, from its origin, in 1754. To the present time, he repudiated the essays by Daniel Leonard, which in turn defended Hutchinson's arguments for the absolute authority of Parliament over the colonies. In Novanglus, Adams gave a point-by-point refutation of Leonard's essays, and then provided one of the most extensive and learned arguments made by the colonists against British imperial policy. It was a systematic attempt by Adams to describe the origins, nature, and jurisdiction of British concepts of constitutionality. Adams used his wide knowledge of English and colonial legal history to argue that the provincial legislatures were fully sovereign over their own internal affairs, and that the colonies were connected to Great Britain only through the king. The Boston Tea Party, a historic demonstration against the British enactments, took place in December 1773. The British schooner Dartmouth, loaded with tea to be traded subject to the new tea tax, had previously dropped anchor. By 9 p.m. on the night of the 16th, the work of the protesters was done. They had demolished 342 chests of tea worth about £10,000, today's equivalent of about $1 million. Adams was briefly retained by the Dartmouth owners regarding the question of their liability for the destroyed shipment. Adams applauded the destruction of the tea. There had been no choice, he thought, and he called the defiant boarding of the vessels and the quick obliteration of the duty beverage the grandest event in the history of the colonial protest movement. He wrote the following day that the destruction of the duty tea by the protesters had been absolutely and indispensably necessary action.